Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. If you asked who the most important jazz musician ever was, you'd get a lot of different answers, from early pioneers like Louis Armstrong to more recent innovators like Chick Corea, but one name you'd be sure to hear is John Coltrane. Coltrane was a saxophonist in the 50s and 60s who played with other jazz legends like Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and Thelonious Monk. He helped lead the development of free jazz and introduced a style of improvisation with the evocative name sheets of sound, but probably his most famous contribution to the language of music is a chord progression known as the Coltrane substitution, or simply the Coltrane Changes. Featured in many of his songs, including Lazy Bird, Countdown, and Giant Steps, the Coltrane Changes were a unique and exciting harmonic structure that provided fertile ground for the sort of dense, complex improvisation Coltrane was famous for, but on its surface it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, and to understand both why it shouldn't work and why it does, we need to talk about a device called the 2/5. The 2/5 is, in many ways, the building block of jazz. Jazz theory, like most modern theory, revolves around the concept of functional harmony. This is the idea that different chords in a key have different jobs, and the 2/5 succinctly portrays the three most important roles behaving exactly the way we expect. There's tonic function chords, which are at rest, represented by this chord at the end. There's dominant function chords, which point the listener's ear back to the tonic, represented by the 5 chord in the middle. And rounding it out, we have the subdominant function chords, like this 2 chord here, which destabilize the sound to help set up the dominant chord's resolution. The 2/5 is a masterclass in functional harmony, all wrapped up in 3 little chords. It's no wonder jazz musicians love it. In fact, they love it so much that they often string them together, making what are called 2/5 chains, where instead of resolving to a tonic chord, the 5 in one 2/5 resolves straight into the 2 of another one. These new 2/5s have what are called secondary function, which means that instead of having a job in the actual key, they have one in a different key that we're just sort of stepping into momentarily. We're basically borrowing them. Anyway, stringing these 2/5s together creates a sense of constant motion, building up tension so that when we finally actually resolve at the end, you get a huge sense of release. Another important thing to note here is the root movement. If we throw out the 5 chords, the bass line moves downwards a whole step at a time. This also helps it feel connected, since each block is so close to the one before it. But Coltrane doesn't do that. Not quite anyway. The Coltrane Changes resemble this 2/5 chain, but he makes a couple important adjustments. First, instead of these minor 7s we've been using, Coltrane swaps in some major 7 chords. This causes a bit of a problem because unlike minor and dominant 7s, major 7s don't really have much secondary function. For the most part, we don't tend to use them unless they're in the key. By the way, this makes finding the major 7 chords a really good tool for figuring out what key you're in. After all, there's usually only 2 of them. Usually. Consider that foreshadowing. The other thing Coltrane does is move the chords around, whereas before we had a root movement by descending whole step. In the Coltrane Changes, he switches to descending major thirds. This is, of course, larger, which is where the name Giant Steps comes from, but another interesting thing happens too. If we go down a major third 3 times in a row, we get right back to the note we started on. The Coltrane Changes loop back into themselves, making it hard to tell where they start and where they end. In fact, with 3 different major 7 chords all spaced evenly, it's not even clear what key we're in. The easy answer would be to say we're not in any, but that's not quite true. There's a huge amount of structure here, and all of it is built on the foundations of functional harmony. It behaves a lot like it has a key, it's just that which key that is keeps changing. We're rapidly cycling through 3 different tonal centers, E flat, B, and G, landing briefly in each one before bouncing off to the next. I mentioned before that the Coltrane Changes were well suited to Coltrane's dense, complex style of improvisation. This is why changing keys every couple seconds allows him to constantly bring in new notes, helping keep his solos fresh and forward moving. The Coltrane Changes were perhaps most famously deployed in the infamous song Giant Steps, and before we go, I want to look at exactly how he used them there. It starts like this, and you may notice that that's not quite what we saw before. He ends the cycle early, hanging on the 3rd major 7 chord instead of completing the loop. He then goes to a 2/5 before doing the same thing over again, but from a different starting point. Then he slows down a bit, and while he's at it, turns the 5 chords into 2/5s to sneak in a little more motion. In other songs, Coltrane used ascending thirds, or started the progression wrong, or moved by minor thirds instead to add a 4th key center, and and this, I think, is the most important lesson here. Making music isn't about blindly following rules. Even if you're using a specific device, you can still play around with it, changing parts to fit your needs. Just because you're playing the Coltrane Changes doesn't mean you have to use them exactly the way John Coltrane did. Not even John Coltrane did that. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you want to help make these videos possible, please consider supporting 12 Tone on Patreon. You can also join our mailing list for scans of all our episodes. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and keep on rockin'.